Okay, welcome to the channel. And in today's video, I'm going to do a little bit of a run through of an article by Dick Witaker, who's the game designer, called Seeing into the Woods. And he did this article for GMT Games Inside. And you can find that on the GMT website for their posts. If you sign up for the email letter, you can get that through your email. So I'm just going to go through that article and try to see if I could understand exactly how line of sight works with so much forest on the maps here. So let's get started. Okay, so our first example is firing over lower wooden boundary hexes. And when we look here, we have this square, and this square is clear terrain. So when we go to the map terrain and elevation, we find that this terrain is at 450 to 469 in height, and this terrain here is higher at 470 to 489. So this is a step lower terrain compared to this one. So both these units are on higher ground, so they're able to see across this lower terrain to fire at each other. Now the 8th Illinois is firing at the 2nd Arkansas across the field boundary hexes and clear hexes. This is a field boundary and this is a clear. No blockage at this level because they are both one level higher. Because the 2nd Arkansas is in a field boundary hex, it has a fire of -1 DRM. So when this one fires across, it's -1. This one fires across, there's no negative DRM for the terrain firing from this direction, but a -1 from that because of the terrain that he is on. So in the next example that Dick shows us, the 24th Indiana and the 2nd Confederate are having a long-range firefight. Both are at the same elevation. They're both in the brown, light brown hexes here. And all the intervening wood hexes are lower, so there's no blockage because these are on the next level up, so they can shoot across there. They're looking across the tops of that vegetation. The 2nd Confederate is firing over a lower field boundary hex, but there's no canopy as the rebels are in a clear hex. So they're firing over a lower boundary here because that curves down. The 24th Indiana is in a wood hex with the fire coming through an adjacent lower wood hex, creating a canopy, so that there is a canopy right there in front of them with a -1 DRM to fire. However, the Federals were already receiving a -1 DRM for being fired on in the wood hex. The 2 DRMs are not cumulative. When the 24th Indiana returns fire at the Rebels, there will be a -1 DRM going this direction when firing through the adjacent wood canopy. So now in this example, the 4th Kentucky is in a wood hex firing through an adjacent field boundary hex. The unit may fire through one wood boundary hex, allowing fire to the opposite edge of review field. The field of fire goes in this direction. If there was a unit here, he could fire at it, there, 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 and here. All those areas allow fire. However, if the fire further into the woods is not permitted, as it would be firing through more than wood canopy boundary hex. So the fire into this hex here would come through one wood canopy and another one, and that would not be allowed. Dick Witaker continues this example, showing the 13th Tennessee one hex further into the wood than the previous example. So it may fire through one wood hex to the closest boundary hex of the review field. So it would only be able to fire at units located here, here, and here, but cannot fire further into the field because of firing through the boundary hex counts as a wood hex for line of sight. So it may fire through a wooden hex closest to the boundary hex of the review field, but no further, as the boundary hex counts as a wooden hex. Once the unit goes here, this counts as another wooden hex. Here, it can fire only through one wooden hex. Here, the 2nd Tennessee has stepped out into the clearing, field boundary hex bordering the review field. It may fire at any unit that is located here, 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 and here. It may also fire at any units located here, there, and closer. In each case, the unit is firing across an open field into wooden hex into the target in the wood. It can fire no further past those hexes. If the second Tennessee were to move closer, it would still only be able to fire here, here, and here. Its field of fire would be much shorter in width because of the distance, but it could still only go 2 hexes into the woods. It cannot fire any further. Back here would not be allowed. Now this example here kind of confused me, but I think it makes sense. So the 8th Illinois and the 6th Kentucky are on higher grounds here than the intervening 2 hexes in between them. Now both are in a field boundary hex with line of sight running along hex sides with a field boundary hex and a wood hex, so the line of sight runs between the two. Now per the series rule, the line of sight is blocked if either hex on a mutual hex side is blocked. In this example, each hex has the same effect on line of sight. Both this hex and this hex provide a canopy for the Union and Confederate units. Small arms fire is blocked by 2 canopy or wood hexes. However, single hex can count only once for wood or canopy for a specific line of sight. So both units would fire at a -1 DRM. Now, if both of them were on the same level as these 2 squares here, they would be firing through 1 wood hex with a DRM of -1 also. So if you have any comments on that, please leave them below. That would be interesting to hear how you interpret that, but that is the way that the man who designed the game interprets it, so I'm going to take that as fact. Here's an example of firing through a field and field boundary shared hex side. So in the series rule, when firing down a hex side between 2 hexes, the line of sight is affected if either hex affects the line of sight. But here we have 2 hexes that have clear terrain. The into the woods rules modify for field boundary hex sides that border fields in clear. So this one borders that field into clear, this hex side. So in this situation, the 2nd Arkansas is firing on the 8th Illinois. The line of sight is clear because it runs along the hex side between the field and field boundary hex. So this one right here, it's clear going through there. So the 2nd Arkansas does not incur the -1 DRM for firing at the 8th Illinois. Now the line of sight would still be clear for the 8th Illinois when returning fire. However, it incurs the -1 dice roll modifier because the 2nd Arkansas is in a field boundary hex. So this direction, no -1. This direction, -1. Okay, so here we are back at review field for firing through woods or wood canopy example. So in this example, we have the 14th Missouri sharpshooters on high ground above review field because it's all at lower elevation. As the Federalists are in the wood hex and firing through an adjacent field boundary, so they're in a wood firing through an adjacent field boundary, any fire into review field would receive a -1. So any fire along its firing path into the review field would receive a -1 dice roll modifier for firing through a canopy hex. Now small arm fire, any possible fire would stop at all of these hexes here. So at that hex, this one, and here. Any firing into any of these hexes along the bottom row would not be permitted because now the sharpshooter would be shooting through 2 wood boundary hexes. One here and one here. However, if firing from this hex to this hex here, which are on the same level, fire would not be permitted because line of sight would be blocked by the canopy that both the firing and target hex have. However, if the Waterhouse artillery occupied the same position, it would have a line of fire to hex X with a restricted line of fire. Restricted line of sight fire would also be possible to any of the hexes located here and beyond, as artillery using restricted line of fire can ignore wood hexes for line of sight. However, this hex would still block any line of sight and beyond because this is at the same elevation as the firing cannon. Okay, so we have another example of restricted line of fire. And here we have 2 Federal batteries and 1 Confederate artillery facing off across Shiloh Creek here. Now, Waterhouse and Cobb's are on the same terrain level, where Lang's is a level higher than Cobb. So that's 1 level, this one is 1 level higher than Cobb. Both Waterhouse and Cobb's could both fire and receive fire through the canopy provided by the lower hexes here and here. So they can both fire at each other. Fire from each artillery unit, however, would be modified as the following. -1 for firing through the woods into the woods, and -1 for restricted line of fire at 4 hexes. So they're 4 hexes apart. Their total fire modification would be a -2. Now if Lang were to fire at Cobb's, they would be modified for -1 fire for into the woods and canopy, -2 for extended fire for 5 hexes, but it would get a +1 for firing at a lower elevation, higher, lower. So the total modifier here would be -2. Now Cobb's could not return fire to Lang because the restricted line of fire cannot target at a higher hex. So this cannot target at this hex because it is a bit higher. Okay, here is another example of restricted line of fire. Polk wants to fire at its intended target of the 8th Illinois. While Polk is capable of restricted line of fire through adjacent lower hex sites, restricted line of fire is blocked after the first wooden hex at the same height. So this one here blocks Polk from being able to shoot at the 8th Illinois. In addition, restricted line of fire is only allowed at 4 or more hexes. So if the 8th Illinois was here, it could not be shot by Polk as both firing hex and target hex would have canopies that are counted as woods. 2 wood hexes block small arm fire or artillery fire at 3 or fewer hexes. Now restricted line of fire would be allowed if Polk was firing at the 2nd Iowa. Now here's an example of ridges. The 13th Tennessee, right here, and the 2nd Iowa, this one here, are adjacent to a ridge and each other. They may see each other and fire. However, the 5th Tennessee, right here, Telemann, cannot fire at each other because Telemann can only see over the ridge to the adjacent hex, and the 5th Tennessee cannot see over non-adjacent ridge hexes. So these two, fire is possible. These two, fire is not. Okay, so here we're going to have a comprehensive example of a line of sight using a couple different locations. So let's just assume that the unit has the proper location and fire and range into each of the hexes. So if they were firing into this hex, fire would be allowed. The intervening hex is a field boundary hex, and the terrain level does not block the line of sight. In this example, fire is blocked. While the unit could fire through either a boundary or wooden hex, the boundary hex is higher than the hex that is being fired from. So this hex, when firing down the spine hex, if either hex would block, the fire is blocked. So because we're firing down this hex right here, this hex blocks the firing to that unit. Now this one to me is a tricky one, but fire is blocked. The base terrain of the wood hex adjacent to the spline is higher than the average height of the 2 hexes, and halfway is considered closer when dealing with non-gradual slopes. The sloping wood hex blocks as it is halfway and is higher than the average of the firer or the target. In addition, the shadow exemption prevents fire. The gully along the hex line does not affect line of sight. So this one's really complicated because of all of this terrain feature in such a small area. But bottom line, line of sight is blocked. In this one, fire is blocked. The sloping wood hex blocks fire, as the added level of the sloping woods makes an intervening hex higher than the average hex size. So this one and this one is considered a non-gradual slope. Here, fire is allowed. The potential blocking train is lower than both the firing unit and the one receiving as the target. Fire is allowed through one wood hex. Gullies do not block the fire. Here, fire is blocked. Fire sight is traced along the spine of the field boundary hex, right there, and treated like a wood. Therefore, the hex blocks the fire. Fire is blocked. Fire through a sloping wood boundary hex blocks the fire. Fire is blocked. The sloping hex adjacent to the spine is blocked. If the sloping hex had just been a field boundary, the line of sight would have been completely clear. Hex sights between field boundary and fields is considered clear. But in this case, we have a sloping hex. Fire is allowed. The field hex does not block. The train level does not block. Fire is blocked. The intervening hex adjacent to the spine are both higher than the firing or the target. So we look here. This is higher than both this level and that level. Here we have the 4th Kentucky with their line of sight into the Jones's field. All of the units in these hexes have a clear line of sight and there are no obstacles. Neither camp nor orchards have any effect on the line of sight. This location has a -1 dice roll modifier for fire because it's a field boundary hex. This one would be exactly the same. Fire is not possible here or here. All of these hexes have a -1 because line of sight goes through the field boundary hex here. So they're all -1. Units located here and here both have a -1 because they shoot through 2 field boundary hexes. The woods here cannot be fired upon because at a lower elevation. If it were at the same level as the firing unit, it could be fired on with a -1 DRM because fire can go through 1 wood hex. Okay, well, thank you for watching that video. I know it was kind of long. I read Dick Witaker's article in Seeing Into the Woods a couple of times, and I know that by laying it out on the map, that's helped me understand it a little better. Hopefully that's done the same for you. I want to thank GMT Games and Dick Witaker for, number 1, great game, and number 2, that nice little article on Seeing Into the Woods, because this game incorporates elevation and obstacles, and it really helps a lot having explanations like that from the person who designed the game. So thanks for watching. If you like this, please do give it a like. Please do share the video and subscribe. I'd like to have you around for future videos, as I will be doing more, because this is one hobby that I really enjoy quite a bit. Thanks for watching.